Scream. A long-standing fan theory argues that Deputy Dewey was actually the third Ghostface killer in the original 1996 movie. The theory suggests Dewey Riley, played by David Arquette, was the mastermind controlling Billy and Stu throughout their murder spree. In the original script, Wes Craven planned for Dewey to die, but kept him alive because test audiences liked him so much. This accidental survival has since fueled decades of speculation about his true role. The evidence is surprisingly compelling. Dewey is conveniently absent during several attacks or arrives immediately after the killer vanishes, as he does following the school bathroom attack. As a deputy, he has complete access to the police station and Sydney's whereabouts at all times. The theory argues his bumbling cop persona is an elaborate facade, similar to the Doofy parody in Scary Movie, which actually turned out to be that film's twist ending. In the scene where he gets stabbed in the back, the camera angle conveniently hides the actual penetration, and he survives a wound that should have been fatal. This theory reframes the entire franchise, turning the most lovable protector into the ultimate betrayal, and highlighting how horror movies often rely on police incompetence that can easily be reinterpreted as police complicity. Signs. The creatures in M. Night Shyamalan's Signs aren't aliens at all, but demons sent to test the family's faith. The film never shows spaceships. The lights in the sky could be angelic or demonic manifestations rather than extraterrestrial spacecraft. Creatures have no technology, weapons, or protective suits. They are naked and use hand-to-hand violence exclusively. They cannot break through wooden pantry doors, suggesting they are bound by supernatural rules of entry rather than limited by physical strength. The biggest plot hole in the film is why aliens would invade a planet covered in water that burns them like acid. This makes perfect sense if they are demons and the water is holy water. The daughter, Bo, is described as angelic or special at birth, and she leaves half-full glasses of water around the house. The theory argues her touch blesses the water without her realizing it. A radio broadcast mentions people are finding a primitive method to kill them in the Middle East, a region with deep religious history. The conflict is resolved not by military might, but by Graham, played by Mel Gibson, reclaiming his faith and seeing the signs. This fixes the movie's most criticized plot hole and transforms the ending from a science fiction logic failure into a perfect theological conclusion. Us. In Jordan Peele's Us, the son Jason was actually switched with his tethered counterpart Pluto during the previous summer. The theory claims the switch happened the summer before the movie takes place, not during the film's invasion. At the beach, Jason is seen building elaborate tunnels in the sand rather than castles, mimicking the underground tunnels where the tethered live. He uses strange language, saying "kiss my anus" instead of "kiss my ass," suggesting he learned English from a limited, outdated vocabulary. He struggles to snap his fingers on beat to the song "I Got Five on It" in the car, implying he lacks the natural rhythm of the humans above ground. He attempts a magic trick with a lighter that fails, suggesting he either forgot the dexterity he used to have, or Pluto never learned it properly. During the climax, Jason realizes his mother Adelaide is a tethered, not because she kills Red, but because he recognizes her as one of his own kind. The final shot of Jason pulling down his mask while looking at Adelaide is a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret origin. This adds a layer of tragedy to the film, implying the real Jason died in the fire, or is trapped in the tunnels, and the boy we root for is actually a monster who successfully integrated, proving the tethered are just as human as anyone else. The Thing. The debate over whether Childs is the Thing at the end of the 1982 classic comes down to a bottle of whiskey and the visibility of his breath. The film ends with MacReady, played by Kurt Russell, and Childs, played by Keith David, sitting in the snow as the camp burns around them. In the freezing air, MacReady's breath creates visible condensation plumes. Childs' breath is arguably not visible, or at least significantly less visible, suggesting he has no internal body heat because he is an alien imitation. Cinematographer Dean Cundey has stated he used specific lighting to create a gleam in the eyes of humans, which is absent in The Thing. Some claim Childs lacks this eye light in the final scene. MacReady was previously seen making Molotov cocktails using whiskey bottles filled with gasoline. The theory argues MacReady hands Childs a bottle of gasoline, not whiskey. Childs drinks it without reacting to the taste of gas. MacReady laughs or smirks, realizing Childs is the Thing because he didn't gag on the fuel. This is the grandfather of ending theories. It turns the ambiguous fade to black into a definitive victory for MacReady, proving he figured it out one last time before freezing to death. The Witch. Black Phillip was telling the truth about freedom, and Thomason made the right choice. The 2015 film ends with Thomason signing the Devil's Book and joining the witch's Sabbath after her entire Puritan family dies. The standard interpretation treats this as damnation and tragedy, but the theory argues that Thomasin actually achieved liberation from an abusive patriarchal system. Throughout the film, Thomasin is blamed for everything that goes wrong, despite being the most competent family member. Her father William is weak and delusional. Her mother Catherine is cruel and vindictive, and her siblings are burdens. The family's religious extremism has isolated them from civilization and doomed them to starvation and misery. Black Phillip, the goat who is actually Satan, offers Thomasin genuine freedom to live deliciously, to see the world, and to have power over her own life. The witches dancing naked in the forest appear joyful and liberated, contrasting sharply with the misery of Puritan existence. Director Robert Eggers has described the ending as a moment of liberation for Thomasin, suggesting her choice is more complex than simple damnation. The theory argues that in the context of 1630s New England, where women had no rights and faced constant accusation and violence, choosing witchcraft is actually choosing autonomy. This reframes the film as a dark feminist parable where the devil is the only entity offering women actual freedom. Autopsy of Jane Doe. Jane Doe is not a victim, but the original Salem witch, and she's actively choosing to kill the coroner and his son. The 2016 film shows a father-son coroner team examining an unidentified woman's corpse that appears to be a torture victim from the Salem witch trials. As the autopsy progresses, supernatural events escalate, killing the assistant and trapping the family in their basement morgue. The standard interpretation treats Jane Doe as a revenge-driven ghost, but the theory argues she's a genuine witch who was correctly identified and executed, and her current actions prove the Salem executioners were justified. Throughout the film, Jane Doe's body shows evidence of ritualistic torture, including a cloth with Leviticus verses stuffed in her stomach, her tongue cut out, and internal organs blackened despite a pristine exterior. These weren't torture, but rather attempts to bind her powers after she was caught cursing the town. The theory suggests Jane Doe deliberately orchestrated her own discovery in the modern era, using her powers to ensure she'd be delivered to this specific morgue. Her body shows signs of life, despite being centuries old, with flowers in her stomach remaining fresh and her joints still flexible. The film reveals she's creating a storm that prevents escape, and manifesting hallucinations to torment her captors. The theory argues Jane Doe isn't trapped in her body suffering, but rather using her corpse as a vessel to continue killing, making her a patient, calculating monster, rather than a tragic victim. This interpretation makes the film more disturbing, because it suggests some people executed as witches actually were dangerous, and that Jane Doe's pristine appearance is a trap to gain sympathy from modern people, who will dismiss the warnings left by those who knew what she was. By the way, if this is your type of content, I create videos like this regularly. I'd really appreciate if you subscribed. Nightmare on Elm Street. Nancy Thompson actually died in the original 1984 film, and everything in the sequels is her dying dream as Freddy drags out her death. The franchise shows Nancy surviving the first film and returning in Dream Warriors, but theorists argue this contradicts the original's ending, where reality and dreams blur completely. The theory suggests that when Nancy turns her back on Freddy at the end of the original film, she doesn't defeat him, but rather retreats into a pleasant dream as she dies. The car that traps her at the very end represents Freddy's true victory, showing he's consumed Nancy's entire reality. Dream Warriors, and Nancy's later appearances, are fabricated by her dying mind, creating scenarios where she gets to help other teenagers and become a therapist specializing in dream disorders. The theory points to how Dream Warriors' Nancy seems more competent and confident than the traumatized teenager from the original, suggesting wish fulfillment rather than real character growth. Freddy allows Nancy to think she's fighting back because her hope and fear taste better than simple terror. The years between films represent seconds in real time, as Nancy's oxygen-starved brain fires its final neurons. This theory makes the entire franchise significantly darker because it means Nancy never escaped, never helped anyone, and died alone in her bed while Freddy mocked her attempts at resistance. Halloween Ends. Corey Cunningham is actually Michael Myers' son, explaining his rapid transformation into a killer and Michael's strange mercy toward him. The 2022 film shows Corey, a young man ostracized after accidentally killing a child, meeting Michael Myers and somehow absorbing his evil. The theory argues the rushed character development makes more sense if Corey has Myers' DNA and is predisposed to violence. Michael lived in Haddonfield for years between kills, and the theory suggests he had relationships during lucid periods between his catatonic states. Corey's mother is intensely overprotective and strange, behavior that makes sense if she had a brief relationship with Michael Myers decades ago and has been terrified of her son inheriting his nature. When Michael and Corey lock eyes in the sewer, The theory argues Michael recognizes something of himself and deliberately passes his mantle to his offspring. The theory argues that Michael allowing Corey to take his mask and kill in his place is behavior wildly out of character unless there's a blood connection. Corey's rapid escalation from accident-prone victim to skilled murderer suggests dormant genetics activating rather than learned behavior. This theory provides logic for Halloween Ends' controversial choices by making Corey's story about inherited evil rather than random corruption, though it raises disturbing questions about who Corey's mother is and what happened between her and Michael. The invitation. Everyone at the dinner party was already dead, and the entire film takes place in purgatory, where the characters must confront their guilt. The 2015 psychological thriller shows Will attending a dinner party hosted by his ex-wife Eden and her new husband David, who are involved in a grief cult. As the night progresses, Will becomes convinced his hosts plan to murder the guests. The theory argues that Will died in a car accident on the way to the party, and everything afterward is his dying mind or afterlife creating scenarios to process trauma. The other guests represent different aspects of Will's psyche, or people he's wronged, forced together to resolve their issues. Eden's cult, which promises freedom from pain through acceptance of death, becomes literal rather than metaphorical in this reading. The red lanterns appearing in windows throughout the neighborhood don't signal a citywide murder cult, but rather other souls realizing they're dead and accepting their fate. Will's paranoia and inability to trust Eden represents his guilt over their son's death and his fear that he deserves punishment. The film's ambiguous ending, where Will either saves everyone or kills innocent people, works in both interpretations. But the purgatory reading suggests Will is being tested on whether he can forgive himself and others. This theory makes the film's slow burn tension a meditation on grief and the afterlife rather than a home invasion thriller. The Lighthouse. Thomas Wake and Ephraim Winslow are already dead, and the lighthouse is their purgatory, where they're forced to relive their sins eternally. Robert Eggers' 2019 psychological horror shows two lighthouse keepers descending into madness on a remote island. The theory argues that both men died before arriving at the lighthouse, with their crimes catching up to them. Ephraim admits to killing a man and stealing his identity, while Wake's obsessive protection of the lighthouse lamp suggests he failed in his duties previously, causing deaths. The film's impossible timeline, where days and weeks lose meaning, indicates their outside normal reality. The mermaid that haunts Ephraim represents the sailor he killed, whose body was likely dumped at sea. Wake's transformation into Poseidon, or Neptune, in Ephraim's visions, suggests he drowned in a previous lighthouse assignment. The light at the top of the lighthouse represents divine judgment or enlightenment, that both men are unworthy to witness. When Ephraim finally reaches the light and looks inside, he's immediately struck down and left to be eaten by seagulls, symbolizing eternal punishment for attempting to reach salvation he hasn't earned. The theory suggests the island is a liminal space, where the two dead men must torture each other as punishment, with the cycle resetting every time one kills the other. This interpretation explains the film's dreamlike logic, mythological imagery, and why escape proves impossible despite multiple attempts. The Others. Grace isn't protecting her children from ghosts, but rather from the truth that she murdered them during a mental breakdown, and the entire film is her denial of what she's done. The 2001 film shows Grace and her children living in a dark house, claiming sunlight will kill the photosensitive kids. The famous twist reveals they're all dead, but the theory goes darker, suggesting Grace's elaborate rules and paranoia aren't protecting the children, but rather maintaining the delusion that she didn't kill them. The film establishes that Grace's husband went to war and never returned alive, driving her into isolation and depression. The theory argues that Grace suffocated her children with pillows during a psychotic break, exactly as shown in her flashback, then immediately suppressed the memory and created the photosensitivity story to explain why they must stay in darkness. The darkness isn't protecting them from sunlight, but rather hiding the truth from Grace's fractured mind. The intruders she fights are actually the new living family trying to move into their house, but Grace perceives them as threats because they represent reality encroaching on her delusion. The medium seance where she contacts the dead and confronts Grace with the truth reveals what Grace herself cannot face. When Grace finally remembers killing her children and they forgive her, it's not a touching moment of acceptance, but rather the children's ghosts trying to free their mother from the purgatory of her own denial. This theory makes the film significantly more tragic because it transforms Grace from a protective mother into a mentally ill woman whose love became lethal. Triangle. Jess isn't trying to escape the time loop, but rather creating it deliberately because each iteration brings her closer to becoming a perfect mother, and she's willing to kill infinite versions of herself to achieve that perfection. The 2009 film shows Jess trapped on a ship where she repeatedly encounters and kills previous versions of herself. The standard interpretation treats this as a punishment for being a neglectful mother who caused her son's death in a car accident. The theory argues Jess is actually in control of the loop and chooses to continue it because each cycle gives her another chance to be the mother she wishes she'd been. The film shows Jess becoming increasingly efficient and ruthless with each iteration, suggesting she's learning and adapting rather than suffering. When she returns home and sees herself yelling at her son, she kills that version and acts loving toward the child, proving she's using the loop to replace her bad iterations with better ones. The taxi driver, who appears to be Death or a psychopomp, asks if she's ready to go, but she refuses, choosing to restart the cycle. The seagulls piling up dead on the ship represent the mounting cost of her choice, with each bird symbolizing a murdered version of herself. The theory suggests Jess has become addicted to the loop because it's the only place she has unlimited attempts to be the perfect mother, making her both victim and architect of her own hell. This interpretation transforms the film from a punishment narrative into a meditation on perfectionism, guilt, and how far someone would go to undo their mistakes. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing so you catch every new upload. Thanks for watching.